Okay. I think
Okay.
Clarice can start.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to begin today's lecture. My name is Clarice Marasquim, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Urbanism at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, where I also work in the graduate program in Urban and Regional Planning, PROPUR, together with researcher Ana Luisa Maffini. I will have the pleasure of co-moderating this session. This event is organized by our research group on urban configurational systems, which focuses on investigating the relationship between urban farm, accessibility, and territorial inequalities, with an emphasis on configurational approaches and innovative methodologies. It is therefore with great satisfaction that we welcome today Professor Lars Marcus, architect and professor of urban design at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. Professor Marcus is an international reference in the field of spatial morphology, with a trajectory that combines solid academic production and applied work. I would like to start by thanking Professor Lars on behalf of our research group and then everyone attending this meeting for accepting our invitation. It's a true honor to have you with us and to engage in a discussion on the themes addressed in your most recent book, Measures and Meanings of Spatial Capital. This work is a fundamental contribution to contemporary urban studies by proposing a new theory on the importance of spatial form as a type of urban capital, the spatial capital, which structures and conditions other urban systems, social, economic, and ecological. This perspective is extremely relevant to current debates on planning, inequality, and urban sustainability, and will certainly enrich our academic and professional reflections. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Ana Luisa Maffini for organizing this meeting, and who will also share a few words about Professor Lars Marcus and the book we'll be discussing today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Clarice. Well, I would also like to welcome everyone and reiterate our sincere thanks to Professor Lars Marcus for accepting our invitation. It's a great honor to have you with us today and share the main ideas from your new book, and I think more importantly, to foster a timely and necessary debate in urban studies, the central role of spatial form in structuring urban systems. For those who might not be familiar with his work, Professor Lars Marcus is an architect and professor of urban design at Chalmers University of Technology, where he leads the Spatial Morphology Group, SMOG. His research is based on the understanding that the built environment is not just a backdrop to urban life, but an active agent in shaping the social, economic, and ecological flows that define cities. He's also the founder of the consultancy firm Spacescape, which applies spatial analysis in public and private urban projects. The book we're discussing today, Measures and Meanings of Spatial Capital, presents an innovative theory of the role of urban form in contemporary cities, introduces the concept of spatial capital, arguing that configured space should be understood as a form of urban resource that enhances other forms of capital. Professor Marcus offers a sharp critique of traditional approaches in geography and urbanism that overlook the configurational dimensions of space. Drawing on methods such as space syntax, the book provides both theoretical and operational tools to analyze accessibility, spatial cognition, and the multiple scales that compose the urban fabric. By proposing a unified theory of spatial capital, Professor Marcus invites us to rethink contemporary urbanism through a more integrated lens, one that is sensitive to the interactions between form, function, and society. Professor Lars Marcus, once again, thank you for being here and for sharing such an important and inspiring work. We're very much looking forward to your talk and the discussion that will follow. So the format of today's lecture will be as follows. First, we're going to hear directly from Professor Marcus, who will present the key ideas and arguments from his book. And following his presentation, we'll open the floor for questions and comments, allowing some time for an open and enriching discussion with all participants. Thank you, Professor Marcus. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm so humbled, really. And I really want to emphasize how honored and happy I am to be invited to make this presentation and have this discussion with you. We have in our research group at Chalmers continuously contact with different research groups in Brazil, and not least with your research group. And Ana Maria has been a guest with us, and we enjoy that very much. And we're very, very happy to continue these contacts and hopefully building further on them. So I'm unusually happy to be invited today to speak about this book, the new book by mine. And I haven't written that many books, so this is the major thing that I have written, and it's been an aim to bring a lot of studies that we've done through the years together in some kind of a synthesis. I feel that we often in research, also in architectural research, urban morphology research, and so forth, often are directed to rather limited studies. We need to do that to make them properly, but also often funding leads us to these very specific studies, and there is often less possibility to bring these together into a larger synthesis, what they build all together and as a larger argument. So for quite a few years ago, like 15 years back, I started to actually write this book in the aim of trying to bring things together that we were doing, and also to be able to make this larger argument or synthesis. But of course, it's just a trial. It's not like it's all drawn together and so forth. But it's an attempt to show that a little bit bigger picture of many different research studies. So in that sense, I'm very, very happy to have finished this and been able to present it, and also then very happy to try to present parts of it also to you today. Of course, there's many themes in this book, so I cannot go into all of them, but I'll try to make some kind of a central argument or a chain of argument that kind of brings together at least many of the major arguments in the book. And the beginning here is, of course, the thing that we all spend a lot of time studying, and I think we all share the fascination of cities, and not least the built fabric of cities. I mean, there's so many disciplines studying cities these days, but I think we have a very particular introduction to the studies, and that is actually really going into detail in trying to understand the built fabric, the physical structure, the spatial structure of cities. And I think that's a very, very important field that maybe is underestimated in the bigger world of academic work, because there's so many studies of cities these days of all kinds. But I think at times that maybe the importance of the built form of cities is underrated in these kind of studies, and greater exchange with these other disciplines in urban sociology, urban economics, urban ecology, and so forth would actually not only enhance our own studies but also the studies of other disciplines. I think we have a contribution to make there that's very important. But back to the fascination of these built fabric of cities. This is the city of Gothenburg, where I work. I live in Stockholm, and Chalmers is located somewhere in this image. But I think this is just a fantastic image. Gothenburg is not such an old European city. It's just 400 years old. But still, we see this tremendous assemblage of different built fabrics, bring it together in a particular form or configuration, as you say, of space. And I find this absolutely fascinating, as you do, and to try to understand how this has deep impacts on everyday life in cities, but also how it structures and give direction to different urban systems, whether they are social, economic, or ecological, is of course deeply fascinating. But it's also something that, of course, is a huge investment, a huge human investment over, in this case, 400 years of knowledge and resources and money and time and so forth, building this fabric that is in parts 400 years old and other parts less old and so forth. And of course, this is not just a neutral background. It also gives a direction, as I said earlier, and as I know you agree with, to a lot of the urban systems. And one thing today is, of course, when one look at this, it's quite obvious how this is a structure that is getting a little bit outdated. It's kind of old-fashioned. This is very much a 20th century structure supporting the industrial economy and the particular social groupings of the time and so forth. And for instance, not acknowledging maybe the green structure as much as we maybe do today and so forth. So today, of course, we are trying to redirect this in new directions to more sustainable aims and trajectories of the systems and so forth. But then, of course, it's a heavy work to try to do that redirection, that transformation or transition into something else and new. But given that, it's also constitutes a huge value, of course. This is a tremendous thing. It's not only the largest of human artifacts, it's also the most valuable. I haven't been looking into this economy of things until more recent years, but I have realized that 2/3 of global wealth is land value. And land value is, of course, enhanced by the built fabric. And at times I also think that we need in our studies to understand that we talk a lot about urban form and so forth, but basically what we're doing is we are enhancing and building on land, making land more useful or more adapted to our own needs and so forth. So often I think it's a reason for us to talk more about this concept of land. And I think land is a very, very coming and more important concept. And in the end, that is what we build on and enhance in our urban planning, urban design, and that we try to make sense of in studies of urban morphology, for instance. So 2/3 of the global wealth is actually land value. It's quite tremendous. And land value is created by, as you know, from real estate agents, location, three things: location, location, and location. And location is in the end created by urban form. At least when we talk about relative location. And I'll come back to that. So we're really working in something that is absolutely fundamental to society and not least the economy of societies. But then I think we get closer to that if we also start to use this concept of land more and not just talk about the built form and the buildings, but rather how buildings and the built form of cities enhances the value of land. I think that's very useful. So we, in this sense, we are in the right business. This is where the money is, so to speak. And I think we should remember that. So we're dealing with something very, very important in society generally. Now, when we talk about land, I do it from the point of view of the basic production factors as they were defined in classical political economy in the early 18th century by people like early 19th century, I should say, like, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so forth. Late, let's see now, 18th century, early 19th century. Where one talked about labor, capital, and land as the three production factors, the three things necessary to produce something. So this was considered, I mean, the really core of economics, how to produce things and what was necessary to produce things. In these days, in our days, of course, the idea of capital has become dominating. So it's not so common to talk about these three production factors, or it has not been so common to talk about these three production factors for a long time, but it's coming back. And the reason why it was kind of hidden was due to the fact of capital and the idea of capital as accumulated value, often in the form of money, which of course made it possible to buy. With money, you can buy anything. So you can buy all of the other production factors. You can hire labor, or you can buy land and natural resources and so forth. So you could speak of capital, and it kind of covered everything. But when you do that, you forget about what really labor and land is about. There's a risk that you forget that. For instance, that labor is, of course, humans. So if they go out to work, for instance, it creates huge social problems. On the other side, land is important, not least as natural resources in production. And if we forget what natural resources really are and just see it as, something you can buy with capital, then we forget that natural resources, of course, is the very fundament of how we live, the biosphere and how it works and so forth. And we may destroy natural systems and so forth, which we are currently experiencing in a very dramatic way. So these days, I think the three production factors are coming back and becoming much more important, and we need to understand the true qualities of these production factors if we are to face the huge sustainability problems, whether social or environmental. So this is also happening in economic theory, that these are coming back and becoming increasingly important. But I talk more about capital and land here. And as I've already said, I think that we really are working with land by enhancing it, by building on it and so forth. But land has been a bit difficult to really capture, and also in the new economy, the industrial economy, the new knowledge economy, so to speak, land has become a bit hidden. It's quite obvious in an agricultural economy that land is important, but in the industrial economy and in the knowledge economy of our time, it becomes more hidden. And the reason for that is that land comes in two forms, fundamentally two forms, probably other forms too. But on the one hand, as natural resources, which is obviously something that you need in any kind of economic production. But it also comes as spatial extension, which is maybe what we study more in urban morphology. But of course, these two are very different ways of presenting land. So it can be difficult to capture exactly what do we mean by land, because it comes in so strange and different forms. I will now talk much more about land as spatial extension, but we may keep in mind that land also is natural resources and thereby very fundamental for the economy. But I think this is one reason why land has become less discussed in contemporary or for long term in economic theory, that it has these different phases, so to speak. But also capital comes in several forms and even more forms. I mean, we talk about capital in all kinds of forms. And I'll stick here only to two fundamental ways of talking about it. First, as accumulated value, as we already touched on. This is the most common way of talking about it, that capital is what you have, the value you have accumulated, and often in the form of money. But in the time of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, one often talked about capital in a very, very different form. Capital as embodied labor. I think that's a very beautiful term and useful. One thought of it as, some of the labor people put into production was spent on the building tools and machines that could enhance labor. So that you could, in later production, you could produce things better. And in this sense, I think also when we talk about capitalism and so forth, or capitalistic systems and so forth, we often think of it as accumulated value, that it's the central thing. But I think it's important to remember that part of that huge power of the capitalistic system that we've seen the last 200 years, that really has changed the face of the earth, is that it also built on technology, on embodied labor. We have had the technological development that is, really extraordinary if one look at long-term history. Today, we now talk more and more about artificial intelligence. I mean, that would be very, very strange things to talk about only 30 years ago. So in the last 200 years, we've seen this tremendous technological development. So that's the other side of capitalism, so to speak. Again, capital presents itself in very different forms, and this may be very confusing. I will speak now about capital as embodied labor specifically. And also, if you start to look at this, it's also a bit confusing because embodied labor can present itself in very many forms too. On the one hand, we can see it as tools and machines. That's the traditional way, and how that enhances human labor. We can do more quicker with these machines and tools. But already in the time of Adam Smith, one talked about buildings also as a form of capital, as an embodied labor that enhanced future labor, the building in itself. So within the building, you had the machines and the tools, and all together you had the factory that could enhance human labor. But of course, also even larger things like infrastructure. So again, we have this range of things that is very wide and a bit confusing for a term like capital as embodied labor. And of course, these are very different. They have very different qualities. And one major quality that differentiate among these different forms of capital is, of course, that buildings and infrastructure is tied to land. Now we're back here. So land is enhanced by capital in the form of buildings and infrastructure. And now we're back to the field we're studying, urban form, how urban form and how buildings and street networks and so forth enhances land into something that becomes more valuable and more effective and so forth, and more productive and so forth. And it's these two that I would like to make a difference, separate from all kinds of other forms of capital, and that I call spatial capital, capital tied to land. And this is the thing, I would say, that really is constituting these 2/3 of global wealth. So it's not a small thing, it's a huge thing. And I think it's useful to separate it from all types of machines or even tools, because that's quite a different thing. So we're focusing on this, and this is what I mean by spatial capital. And that's, of course, what we deal with, both in the studies of urban morphology, but also in our teaching in urban planning and urban design and so forth. So if we continue now and talk about spatial capital in this sense, which is a combination then of land and buildings, so to speak, as value and try to understand that. We can, of course, talk about it as both use values and market values, or real estate values, concrete monetary real estate values. And often we talk about it I think in our teaching, for instance, very much about the use values, all kinds of things that we create, places where people enjoy to be. This is just one image trying to concentrate all ideas about build form as a use value. Of course, we could imagine all kinds of situations where people meet, where everyday life takes place, but also in the larger scale, how it influences large-scale process like, social segregation, gentrification, market locations, and so forth. So in all of these ways, you could say that the built fabric of cities, what I call spatial capital here, enhances the use values of the city. But for a while, we could also spend some time on the market value, the concrete real estate values, because that's really exciting. And I think maybe we do it too little. And that's the reason why maybe our field is not taking the position I think it should in the larger debate of the future of cities and so forth. Because interestingly, again, it's like I'm dividing everything in two parts here. But again, real estate values are constituted by two parts. On the one hand, land, the value, and on the other hand, value of land improvements. And this is very, very important distinction. Land improvements is quite obvious. It's all kinds of buildings or landscaping, whatever we build and construct on a piece of land. It's a land improvement, and that's part of what creates the value of land. But land, on the other hand, in itself, the value of land itself has very, very much to do with location. Here we find this connection to location, because we realize whatever building we build on a piece of land, its value is very, very much defined by where we build that building, in what city, in what part of the city. The value changes completely, almost. The same building could be without value in certain cities and hugely valuable in another city or another location in the city. And here is where that concept of location comes in. So it's really related to land value in itself, whereas the other part of real estate, a complete real estate value, is the land improvement, which is another part. And I'll come back to this because this is a very important and interesting distinction. But to begin with, I think we in urban morphology have developed different tools whereby we could describe these two things, because it's also a truth that land and land values in economic theory has proven very difficult to describe and analyze and measure. And in many senses, this is what we do in urban morphology, different directions of urban morphology, develop ways of describing land and land improvements. So we have developed tools we can use to actually describe and measure, even measure both of these dimensions, I would argue. So now we get into the measures of spatial capital. Later on, we'll get to the meanings of spatial capital, but let's stick to the measures of spatial capital for a while. Measuring variables of spatial form. We could then see that we very often, for instance, have developed ways of describing accessibility and density. And this would fit, on the one hand, land values. If we speak of land values, location, what creates location in a city? Well, it is the street network to a very large degree. How the configuration of streets connects different things to each other is, of course, essential for the location, and thereby the accessibility to that location, and thereby constitutes a very large part of land value. On the other hand, we can also measure land improvements, and that's pretty much what we do when we talk about density. In simple terms, buildings and how they add floor space. So by improving a piece of land by a new building, we often add floor space, increase the density, and that increases the value of the land. So let's continue now and take one of each of these one by itself. Accessibility, the location and accessibility to land is to a large degree then defined by the street network I'm arguing. And we now talk about location. We of course talk about relative location, not absolute location. Absolute location is of course where we are on the planet, so to speak. The longitudes and latitudes of things, you know, pure geographic description of where am I at this moment. That's absolute location. And of course, that's something that's very difficult for us humans to change. But relative location is actually something that we do create as humans. Relative location concerns how one location is related to another location or many other locations. And this is exactly what we do with the street network, I would argue, in cities. We create particular relations between different locations with using the street network. And this is actually an absolutely fantastic thing that we are creating. And I would argue, with support of these earlier numbers, it's one of the absolutely most valuable things you can create. You create location. And as we said earlier, it's a huge part then of a very, very valuable dimension of land and so forth, which is a large part of the economy and so forth. So this creation of relative location is a rather fantastic thing, of course, and it puts every location in relation to every other location within a city. But if you look at the larger infrastructural systems, it actually puts every location into every other location in the whole world, right? So it's a rather fantastic thing. And in that sense, it also locates each and every person, individual in a city, in a particular relation to every other individual in that city, or anything that you have, anything kind of physical object and so forth, is related to every other physical object in a city by the means of a street network. The street network here is, of course, a simplification. We may have tram lines and we may have walking paths and so forth, but I think you understand what I'm aiming for here. So it's a rather fantastic thing that structures everything more or less and put things in a particular relation to everything else. In short, it creates location. And as we have seen, it's about the most valuable thing that we can find. So in this sense, I'm trying to illustrate that with this image. Of course, we can look at the individual housing project like the one to the left here, taken from Gothenburg. But depending on where we put this housing object within a city, if we look to the right here, it has a huge impact on the qualities of this thing, even though it would be identical. If we put them in different location to each other, over time, we can sense how the things in the center will become very different from the things in the periphery, for instance. So the location here in the end will have a huge impact on what this thing actually is, and not least have a huge impact on the value of this. And there's a very simple way of measuring this kind of relations, the kind of network in the system or the measuring the system and the location within the system. And that is done by what's called centrality. And I know you know very well what centrality is, but I'll repeat it anyway. So it's a kind of a regular distance measure, but where regular distance is measured from point A to point B, centrality is the mean distance from point A to all other points or all other places in a city. So it's a kind of really, putting it this way, I think it kind of captures how it really is about defining location in the system. And it's quite a simple measure in a sense, but it captures a lot, and it captures really this locational property of one place in a set of other places within a system. And of course, this is what's been done in space syntax studies for a very long time, and also in other directions on urban morphology. But space syntax were very early in developing tools and understandings where street networks were understood as networks in the more scientific way, and the measuring of the centrality of that network or system was key within the space syntax development. And of course, you've seen many of these images where the colors here, the color range showing how the red is more centrally located. The red streets are more centrally located in relation to all of the other streets, and the green and blue are far less centrally located. And of course, you also know about all these correlations that were discovered when making these kind of descriptions, that there's a tendency for people to walk along the more centrally located streets, and thereby we maybe get more retail on these streets, and maybe the rents for low floor space and so forth are higher along the and so forth. So there's a long argument here how space connects to all of these social and economic dimensions of the space. I would like to emphasize here importance that I think at times actually is maybe not emphasized enough. It's not only that space syntax were early in thinking about cities as networks. Actually, they were early in these, because network science is a rather young discipline, and applying these ideas to cities and thereby looking at the network measurement of centrality very early, and developing tools to describe that and measuring that. But the other thing that's a huge contribution of space syntax is, of course, also the way to measure distance, which is not only that one measures centrality rather than the regular distance from A to B, but the actual measuring unit is the axial line originally in space syntax. And the axial line actually is connected to human affordances, as it's said in environmental psychology, but it's connected to fundamental properties in humans of abilities to move and visually overlook things. And it has strong support by theories in environmental psychology, for instance, the theory of affordances by James Gibson. And I think this is another of these really important contributions, that we're not measuring the metric distance, but with the topological distance of axial lines, and axial lines can be connected to human perception, human cognition, and human movement. So in this case, it's also trying to illustrate that it's not these abstract lines only. These abstract lines capture something that one can see in the images to the left, a potential to move and overlook things. And that's what defines these spaces, and that's what constitutes the measuring unit in space syntax. Even though in more recent times, when I've gone to using road center lines and so forth, but the way that it's measured now with angular distance and so forth, it kind of comes back to this axial line idea, this measuring unit related to human cognition and so forth. And I think this is super important to understand space syntax, and I'm sure you know all about this already. So we've talked a lot about now how to measure land value by way of street network and the accessibility that is created by street networks. So let's go to land improvements. How can we measure that? And of course, we can measure that using density, which is probably the most common measurement of urban form there is. But these measurements that often are area-based are often also very crude, as you well know. All of these three cases actually has the same density, so it doesn't really capture very much of the quality of the different locations or examples here. So it's a rather crude measurement. This led us to early on in our work in Sweden at KTH at the time in Stockholm, to develop something we call place syntax analysis, which is transforming density descriptions into accessibility descriptions of density using the measurement typical for space syntax, the axial map, the distance measurement I just talked about relating to cognition and so forth. And the idea is rather simple, and it's done in different ways by others. Of course, it's not totally original, but the originality here is using the distance measurement used in space syntax to do such an accessibility analysis. What is done is simply using, as a conventional density analysis, like you see to the left here, where each and every plot or parcel, the density of the built form of each plot and parcel there is measured and given a color depending on the degree of density. Now, the same data we suggested could be transformed into not a density measurement per area, but an accessibility measure instead. So the same data using the actual map as a measurement, a distance measurement, is represented here to the right as an accessibility to floor space instead of a density of floor space. So what's done here is simply that we measure from each and every parcel how much built floor space you can access within a radius, in this case 1,000 meters. So on the left we have the density of floor space. How much floor space do you have per area of each plot and parcel to the left, and to the right you have the accessibility to floor space. It's the same data, but it's a very different result. Both of these analyses could be very useful, but we more often come across the measurement to the left, whereas the one to the right obviously could be very, very useful for very many, not least planning cases. So that's another way of measuring then density as accessibility rather than as a density. And then we can combine this. So you here have on the one hand the street network in brownish yellow color range, the centrality of the street network. In this case, I think it's within 800 meters or even 1,000 meters. And then in blue, you have the accessibility to built floor space within a radius of 500 meters, measured from each and every plot in the area, but represented on buildings so that it may be more telling. And here, I think it's a very useful addition to the regular space syntax analysis, because it kind of also explains when space syntax does not really correlate so well with human movement and so forth. And the explanation can often be that you have a very different accessibility to floor space in different locations and so forth. So these two together are I find very useful. But in our case, it's a way of, on the one hand, measuring land, and on the other hand, measuring land improvements. Also, briefly touching on the fact that we have made our contribution to the correlation studies between spatial form and human or pedestrian movement. We did a huge analysis some years ago in London, Amsterdam, and Stockholm, combined these three cities, where we had about 20 areas in each city, and then 20 locations within each area. So it was a huge measurement where we, on the one hand, measured the centrality of the street network, and on the other hand, measured anonymized Wi-Fi signals from mobile phones, and then correlated this. So throughout this very, very large study, we reached a correlation value of about 0.65. And then one should remember it's three different cities. All these 20 areas in each city was very different and so forth. And still we have this very strong correlation. Of course, the correlation varies a lot between areas and so forth. But generally, I think this is an important contribution to the idea that there is a correlation between street centrality and pedestrian movement. So all together then we can bring this together in a huge way, and this is the image of parts of London. And here you can see on the one hand the reddish range, which is the centrality of the street network. And in the background, you can see a grayscale range, which then captures the accessibility to floor space. And of both then relate, the first one relates, the centrality measure of the street network relates to a description of location and land. And the accessibility to floor space is then a description of land improvements or buildings, so to speak. So that kind of concludes that we can develop measures of spatial capital. And having done that, we can start to do these studies on the large-scale systems in cities. For instance, the social systems and the social capital in cities, or the cohesion in social systems. We can go into market systems and the location of different micro markets within the city and how it relates to the spatial structure, but also go into ecosystems in cities, which we have done quite a lot of work with, even though it demands certain other things, because of course it's very different in many ways from the human social and economic systems. But still, we can also try to understand how this built form of city supports or put obstacles to living ecosystems in cities. And we have studies in all of these directions. But connecting now more to the meanings of spatial capital. Okay, so there's a correlation here. We can measure things and so forth. But what does it really mean? And I would like to emphasize this, that often when we talk also, not least in space syntax, we have this idea that, okay, there's a correlation to the pedestrian movement. But movement is not really what we're after. But rather that movement and that pattern of movement means that people in different spaces in a city spend time in different locations in co-presence. That repeatedly there's certain amounts of people that uses a space and come together there in co-presence, not necessarily even talking or discussing with others, but they just pass and share the space for a moment. And this is no small thing. It's a hugely important thing, of course. This is the most central place in Gothenburg, called the Brunnsparken. And maybe you have 5,000 people passing here per hour at peak hours. And that's quite an extraordinary thing in Gothenburg, because Gothenburg is the second city of Sweden. But in most part of the city, it's rather, you don't meet that many people. It looks it's kind of a, you could get the idea that it's a small town and so forth. But in this space, you really get a sense of that Gothenburg is quite a big city. Then depending on this fact that there's so much people moving here. And it's not, you also get a sense that it's not just unusually many people moving here. It's also people from most parts of the city. So it's kind of an integration of people that for a moment share space together. And in social terms, then we're talking about, the public sphere, the kind of fundament of society, that people belong to each other and are in need of each other. And here one can get a sense of that in the city, that you for a moment share space. Of course, it also gives a lot of the quality to this space, that you have this large amount of people. You get a sense of a big city, anonymity and so forth. And in economic terms, it also means that it's a large market demand located here. So it kind of also defines a market that is unusually large. And typically around this space, you have these big brands, you have McDonald's and so forth, typically adhering to that kind of a large market. So all of these things come together. The spatial form of city make this repeated co-presence of people of a certain size, an unusually large size in this location, that creates the public sphere, and it creates a market that is larger than in any other place in the city. So it's a remarkable thing relating to fundamental things in society, and in the study in the social sciences when they study cities, not least. And it's emphasized by moving a little bit to the side to a place called Haga, where maybe there's 500 people moving per hour. It's not so far from the other one, but suddenly you get a very different feeling. It's not a large city anymore. It's a small town feeling. there's not everybody from all over Gothenburg moving here. There has been a selection, so to speak. People here, they may even know each other and say hello. It's not that same anonymity. The large brands, McDonald's is not here. This is not a market demand enough for McDonald's. You have more self-owned shops and so forth. So there's a lot of things that changes. Again, depending, of course, on the amount of co-present people moving here. Of course, also the architecture is very, very different and contributes to the feeling of the place. But it's also about the people and amount of people. And then if you go to a large scale new housing projects, this is actually the one I showed only earlier in the plan. And maybe it's just 550 people an hour here. It's very little people moving. Most of them live in the neighborhood. There's not much demand. There's maybe a pizza parlor and so forth. There's not a lot going on. And the people you meet here is most likely living in the area. So it's a very different situation, a different public sphere, a different market, a different experience to be there. Again, to a large degree, depending on the amount of people being co-present in space, which in the end is a result of the spatial structure of the city. And again, now we can start to think of the role here of urban form in the larger society, how it creates these things. And that's what I mean by meanings of spatial capital, that it has a meaning in all of these different experiences and in studies of social and economic dimensions of cities and so forth. And I shall not go very far, but in the book, I go a little bit deeper into some disciplines like sociology to try to find a relation to sociological theory where one could connect these kind of studies of urban form to the ideas of sociology, for instance. And this is actually rather long chapters in the book, but I will just briefly touched on it because I was quite fascinated by coming across the writings of Émile Durkheim, who actually is the maybe the most important person when it comes to creating sociology as a discipline. He may be not the most important sociologist. He's a very important sociologist too, but he was also very important in creating a discipline of sociology. And it's important because he argued that any study in sociology needs to rest on two pillars, something he called social physiology and social morphology. That were the two pillars. And social physiology is very much what you would find in any sociological study of, relations between people, and it could be most everything, neighborhood experiences or studies of workplaces and how people interact and so forth. But the other pillar that he calls social morphology actually comes very close to what we would call urban morphology. It's about the actual built fabric and how it creates a proximity between people of different kinds and how it brings people into close relations. And he argued that this is absolutely essential with that kind of study if we are to do sociological study. So this is a connection I'm arguing to urban morphology, because within sociology, this pillar of social morphology was not really ever developed. It seems like human geography maybe took that part. But of course, in our studies of urban morphology, we also fit the description that Durkheim was doing. So we have a central role in these studies of sociology, and not least when we talk about sociology of cities, urban sociology, we have a very important role here. And I will not go into all these details. There's a lot more here. It's truly exciting, but there is a very strong connection to sociology here. Similarly, if we go to economics, taking another old gentleman here, Alfred Marshall, who was the first economist to really take an interest in cities and talking about them as specific and particular settings for economic practice or economic endeavors of any kind. And he again emphasized the importance of the proximity of people in cities, which he argued created what he called agglomeration effects. That is, that there are benefits in cities for economic activity due to the proximity of people that make them often more successful than less, so to speak, dense or locations of high proximity. They created markets, as he argued, markets of very different types, where people, different things and people come into close contacts due to the proximity of cities. They create thick labor markets, markets of labor, quite obviously. They create markets of input things that you may need in the production, obviously also output markets for the products of production, but also, not least important in our time, they created knowledge markets where people with expertises in different fields were close to each other and could exchange knowledge in different fields. So again, we see in the very beginning of economics in relation to cities, how the spatial dimension is absolutely essential, and the creation of proximity or co-presence of people is argued to be absolutely central by the people who actually were creating these disciplines, 150 years ago or 150 years ago. We could go very far into this, but I find this very exciting. So we see here now, anyway, how did these descriptions contribute to descriptions, actually, of both the use values and real estate values or market values of the built form. So we can describe this. Also, it has these relations to the proximity that Marshall was talking about, or the co-presence that Durkheim was talking about. But it could also be seen then as a value in itself, as a part of creating real estate values. So both the market values and the use values can be, to a very large degree, described here by methodology from urban morphology. And finally, I don't know if I'm running late. Anna Maria, am I running late or?
There's still time. There's still time. Go on.
Okay. I'll try to round up a little bit here. So in that sense, I'm arguing that by these rather simple tools, we are describing not everything when it comes to the market value of a piece of land, for instance, obviously, and that is also affected by so many things going on around it. But it does describe some very substantial part of that, a dominating part of the potential value of a particular piece of land. And it's also a long-term thing. It's not something that varies overnight. It's something that's rather stable and so forth. So I'm arguing here, I'm not saying that these descriptions of what I call spatial capital captures everything when it comes to the market value of land or anything, but it captures something very, very substantial. And of course, even that part, that substantial part, can vary due to other things, how the interest rates goes up and down, and the economy and so forth. But there is something substantial that we can capture here that I think one is not very good at doing in economic theory at the moment. So I think we have a contribution to do here. But it could also be related to the sustainability issue and to discussion about sustainability policy. I argue then we can analyze and measure essential parts of the real estate values. And often when we talk about sustainability, I think we focus on the use dimension, like let's create cities where you don't need to drive cars, so you don't have so much CO2 emissions, or we could work against segregation by creating better neighborhoods and so forth. So it's all, to my mind, kind of going that use. But here I'm arguing that it could go into the real estate values again. So see if you can follow me here. We said earlier that the value of land improvement could be described as the accessibility to floor space, and the value of land could be described as the centrality of the street network. Very simple, but still it captures large parts of this. But then the interesting question comes, who creates these values? Well, the value of land improvements, new buildings, is quite obviously created by the landowner. The landowner can decide if it's permitted by the municipality to put a new building and invest a lot of money in a new building on his or her piece of land. But who creates the value of land itself? The location. It's obviously something that the landowner cannot at all contribute to, because the location is defined beyond the limits of the piece of land, right? What's defining that, we've said, is the street network. That is, it's an investment by the public. And it can also be enhanced by other amenities invested by the public or the municipality, if we say that. Like new schools or builds or trams or public transports of different kind. It could even be enhanced by neighbors that invest in their land. But the individual landowner is actually not contributing to the value of land. And this is important because the value of land is often the greater part of a real estate value, and the value of land improvements, the building, is a much lesser part of the land value. If you look at these images, it's from different sizes of cities in Sweden, and you see Stockholm at the bottom. And the larger the city is, the larger part of a real estate value is made up of land value, that is location, if we simplify, and far less is made up of land improvement, that is buildings. The building is not so large a part of the land value as the location. So in that sense, the public, the municipality, or maybe the neighbors contribute the larger part of the land value, individual land, piece of land, or the real estate value, and the landowner only a smaller part. I mean, and this is the argument is rather simple. If you are in a big city, you have very little. If you're on Manhattan, you have very little land, but you have a lot of buildings. But if you're in a rural setting, you have a lot of land, but very few buildings. So if you find a piece of land in a rural setting with a building, the building becomes very important and it raises the value of land, but it does not on Manhattan in the same sense. And this is the reason why, as you probably well know, that in large cities we can pull down 20-story buildings just to have the opportunity to build a 24-story building, because that will, in a short time, be repaid by the rents of the building and so forth. So I think this is very exciting because it opens, and this is the large old gentleman I'll show. It opens for something that's quite exciting, I think, what we could call a Georgian tax reform. This is a bit debated and everything, but it's quite exciting, I think. Henry George was not really an economist, he was a journalist, but he brought forth the idea that one should make a tax reform where one switched tax on labor to tax on land, exactly due to the argument that so much of the land value is created by the community anyway, or the municipality and neighbors and so forth, that it should be taxed and brought back to the community or the municipality, since it's not really the landowner that is creating that value. And instead one could lower and by doing that one could also lower the tax on labor, because there's a lot of tax possible on land. There's huge values there, as we've seen many cases of here. And instead you could lower the cost of labor. And he argued it's very reasonable because today we tax labor to invest in public amenities that raises the value of land, but we are not always taxing land to that degree. So it's kind of a switch of money from labor to land. Now, land taxes look very, very, very different in very many cities and countries and so forth, but there is a tendency that maybe land tax is lower and income tax are very high and so forth. And of course, he put forth this idea, and at the time in the late 19th century, this was a hugely embraced idea, and he had a large following. He was much, much more read than Karl Marx, for instance, and much more raised the worries about things among landowners to a much larger degree than Karl Marx did at the time, and so forth. Anyway, in the end, this didn't come to much, but it's kind of an interesting idea. And let's push it one more step. If we would raise the value tax on land, on the one hand, that also would mean that natural resources would be more expensive. And maybe it would mean that we were more careful in how we use natural resources. And maybe it would lead to an idea that we could spend more time creating quality products than consumer products that we throw away and create and produce new items. The idea of having with lower taxes on labor, we could also make the argument that it's not so costly to repair things and so forth. So there's a potential there that such a switch of taxes from income to land would also be a great support for an environmental sustainability. But now aiming at the very core of economics, by taxing and things like this. Again, this is a rather loose idea, but this is where my book ends up. So I want to have some kind of more exciting ending to it. But on the other hand, it's the same thing when it comes to spatial extension. Oh, I forgot to be it. That if actually, if one think about it, due to location and not least due to centrality, there is a rather unfair distribution of things. What's centrally located is by definition closer to all resources in society than a more peripheral location. For instance, if we build a new school or park in the periphery of the city, maybe in support of people with less money or something like that, it's still very accessible from the center due to the centrality. Whereas the location in the periphery where we choose to put this school, for instance, is very far from the other side of the periphery. So in that sense, the center always wins or gains. So again, to draw, and that is part of raising the land values of central locations. So again, the argument to tax these raises in land value to maybe redistribute that kind of value to the periphery is very sensible. Now, what we talk about centrality here is, of course, very it has many nuances, but in principle, so in both of these cases, you could argue that such a land switch would contribute to both environmental and social sustainability. Anyway, that's my final argument, and I'm sorry I was a bit rushed here in the end, but this is the reason I talk about this as a contribution to a theory of land also. And I think that the kind of studies we all share in urban morphology of different brands and directions all really have a central role in these very, very key areas of society, both in its social dimension and its economic dimension. Thank you so much for listening. And here's the book, of course, if you're interested. It's free access, open access to MIT Press. Just Google it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lars.
Thank you.
I think we can open now to questions. to see if
Yes,
anyone.
I'll be happy to.
Interesting.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we have some time. I think we can start with Ramon.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Lars Marcus, for the excellent conference and for the valuable contributions you have made to urban science. And I had the privilege to meet you at Chalmers last year.
I know.
Well, going to my point, a central idea in your book is that the built form is not merely a passive backdrop, but rather acts as a social agent. So spatial capital in this sense, or as defined by this way, can be analyzed through three dimensions. No, you said accessibility, density, and the land use diversity also. So in this
Yes,
case,
yes.
measured by the configuration of plots, not directly. On the other hand, I can in countries of the global south, for example, Brazil, which are marked by rapid processes of social and urban transformation. This transformation result in mosaics of fragmented and dynamic morphosocial landscapes. So I would question you: do you believe it would be relevant for a better understanding of the concept of spatial capital to incorporate into the notion of, I would say, this pure built form, to incorporate to it other actors linked to social and functional processes? I don't know, just to illustrate, I am thinking, for instance, of urban areas designed and built for specific uses and social profiles that sometimes in a very short time undergo degradation processes. Probably degradation is not the best word, but lightening processes, no, and are appropriated by an entirely different social groups, even thought the urban form with those three dimensions remains unchanged. So we have exactly the same plot structure, the same buildings, the same network, but the social composition and the land uses in the area change dramatically sometimes in a very short time. This is very common in Brazil, but it's certainly not as common in Sweden, for example.
Yeah, but we've had some dramatic changes in Sweden too. I think you know, Ramon. It's not so. But no, and this is often. Yeah, there's so many things to your question, and very, very interesting. I think to start somewhere, I think there is also, if you go into other disciplines studying cities, there I think one not always does the proper distinction between things that changes fast and things that changes slow, so to speak. So a tendency that everything changes fast, so to speak. But I think there is an importance of also what I think we do, describe things that changes slow, even though, as you say, the social changes may be quick. But I think that I cannot speak for Brazil and all which I know too little about. But I think that that there are certain commonalities, even though there's certain things changes, certain things also stay the same. And I think that is a dimension that is very important to really capture, because then otherwise we can get this feeling that everything just floats around and everything. But I think there is patterns, even though you have a rather distinct social change, maybe you still have the same places where people meet, and maybe they do different things there, but there's still, that's the locations that the things happen.
Yes.
I mean, you often talk about like particular shops or something. Oh, we don't have shops selling milk or whatever they had in the 50s in Sweden. No, but you have another that amenity shop. There's something else you do now. For a while, so it turned into the where you rented VHS movies. You don't do that anymore either, but you do. But it's something. It's so it rather to so it could look on the surface that everything just changes, but there's something on a deeper level that actually stays the same. It's this thing that you want to have close to and so forth. And of course, I think that's important. And in space syntax, you comment the idea of the generic functions. That the argument made by Bill Hillier that if we look at the specific functions, we got confused in relation to build form because they seem to like, oh, everything happens like this. But if you look at the generic functions, they kind of stay, there's a similarity there. And I think that could be also very important to understand these more rapid changes, and not least what, for instance, urban planning could contribute to or to this. Because I think if we do not look at these slow variables that the build form is, and start to think that they don't make any difference, then we really may create a very chaotic situation.
Yes.
Sorry for being long here, but just adding one thing. There's in the book, there's quite a lot of discussion about the concept of resilience. And very briefly, resilience is actually the thing in a complex system that stays the same, right? So if a city is a complex system, that is, it's kind of unpredictable. But at the same time, when we look at cities, they are exceptionally predictable. The strange thing is rather that, millions of people share the same city and things are pretty predictable. People tend to move in certain places some days, and there's something else happening on Sundays than in the weekdays and things like that. It's kind of predictable. And then the argument is that what creates that stability in a complex system is the slow variables of the system. For instance, in a city, the built form is very important to keeping this stability in this. Of course, there's a complexity. There's a lot of things happening, but there is also continuity. And in very technical terms, that is what is the resilience of the complex system. So resilience is this dimension of complexity that make things stay in place. And in cities, one could argue that maybe one of the absolutely most important things that make cities a bit stable is the built form of the city. It's what creates resilience in an otherwise maybe very chaotic situation.
Okay.
So I don't know, it was a long argument, but we could spend hours talking. It's a very good question.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. It's good.
Anyone else has a question? I think Barbara does.
I do.
Yes, great.
Hello, Professor Lars. Nice to meet you. It was a great lecture. Thank you very much. I am beginning this past year to study resilience and how it can be related to urban form. And I was very interested by this last, by the response, the answer you gave, Ramon. And I think when you're dealing with resilience of the urban form, as you just said, for us that we, due to the floods, we are using improperly the word resilience in our everyday talks here in Brazil. And I think it's been difficult to relate the resilience we are aiming to achieve in order to relate it to the ability of the society to keep moving, to keep doing the everyday stuff, and how it is related to the urban form seen as a complex system. And I was wondering, how can we bring this last answer you gave to Ramon to our context. I mean, okay, I understand their resilience in a complex system, looking to the urban form as the most stable part of a system where it will prevail the continuity of a system. But how can we operate this resilience in our reality down here, dealing with floods and droughts and the climate change itself? And I don't know if your research looks at these aspects, or if you're dealing with these issues or not.
No, of course, there's. I agree very much with what you're saying. If we come back to these more specific, but what you started with to say that it's often a bit misused. Maybe it often the term resilience is often becoming as synonymous to sustainability, which I think is maybe misleading, because it's actually sustainability is, I mean, it's more a value. It's a value we want to create. Sustainability. Resilience is more of a property, really. I mean, you could make the argument that one of the largest problems we have today is the deep resilience of an unsustainable system. Our cities, it's like I pointed to Gothenburg. It's the wrong city, right? But it's very resilient. It's very difficult to change now, because it's if you say, oh, you shouldn't drive your car anymore, you should bike. Okay, but we have a city where we created long distances, so it's very difficult to not go by car. So it creates it becomes a resilience. So even though people want to not use the car and bike instead, for instance, if a very simple example, they can't, because the system is pointing. So, and that shows the resilience of the old system. So it's not necessarily something good, resilience, or rather it's neutral. But I think the importance is to see this these long-term or slow factors and so forth, and how it can relate then to human activities and so forth, but also maybe to like you talk about flooding and heat problems and so forth, and where we maybe have built situations that are not at all resilient, really, in that case, because we have these problems coming up all the time. And maybe we could see at times that man in older times had learned these things better than we do. I think there's another dimension there that becomes to the where resilience concept is very revealing, maybe, and that is, I think, not least in maybe in the 20th century, I think we all wanted to become engineers somehow, or even architects wanted to become architect, and in planning become, and in engineering there is this idea, often I'm simplifying, because, and there is, of course, engineering is excellent and useful and all of that, but that is that you try to optimize solutions, right? You want to have the perfect solution, but maybe for one thing at a time. So you have a machine for everything. I think about, we have in our kitchens, we have a little machine for toasting bread, another one for whipping cream, a third one, and so on. You have these machines, they're perfect for you. But whereas architecture and the form of a city is multifunctional, so you cannot really optimize it. And it's not the point to try to optimize it, because it's much more sophisticated in a sense than an optimized thing, because it does 100 things at the same time. So it allows, so in that sense, instead, so I think in a lot of planning in the let's say 20th century, we try to make these optimized solutions of all kinds, car traffic and in all kind of traffic solutions, but perfect. Also, when we built maybe functionalist apartments, the measurements were exactly so things fit in. I remember my first apartment was a one room apartment where there has this alcove to put a bed. And this apartment was designed in the 1930s, you know, Le Corbusier. It was kind of engineering. There were perfect measurements for everything. So when I moved in there in the 90s, my bed didn't fit into alcove because it was too large. Because in the 30s, these beds were smaller. And this is exactly this optimizing. So, I mean, it's so great because I made it perfect. Yeah, but maybe it's not perfect we want. We want something that can live for a long, and then you talk about resilience, I think. So it's a bit coming back to these things, like in street network, where we drive electric cars where we had horses earlier, right? And still it works, right? Whereas other solutions just doesn't work anymore. It just took 15 years and they're outdated because they're too. So I think this is a dimension. And again, I think in our discipline and our professional dimension of our discipline, we are good at these kind of resilient, these not optimized, but these multifunctional solutions that really can live for a very long time. And I think we should, rather than try to become the engineers, we should argue. I don't mean that our engineering is not good, but it's good for its purposes. But in our purposes, I don't think we should be engineers in that sense. The urban forest shouldn't be optimized. It should allow for a range of things. Again, a bit like the generic function that Bill Hillier talks about.
Maybe
So
the
that's a way.
optimization of the
Sorry.
system doesn't go through the optimization of each part.
No, I think that, and then maybe you could have, I mean, you can decide, let's say, you have a street system and a system of public space, and that should be very generic, really, so we can allow for all kinds of things. But then, of course, for a moment, you could design a particular piece of public space because this time, you know, we want skateboards or whatever. We want a skateboard park, yeah, so you have many layers actually where you could work when you say about the particular pieces. But certain things, I think what we become bad at is these generic solutions. We're kind of good at the specific solutions, but not so good at the generic solutions that last over time. Maybe, I don't know, speculating.
Thank you. I think that's the time we have. I know that there are other questions, but I think we should release Lars.
Okay, then we could come to an end of the session. Thank you again, Professor Lars, for being with us. We were talking in the beginning that we are going to arrange a present coming of in Brazil to meet people in presence, and maybe invite other laboratories, other people researching to join us, and maybe we could make a real meeting with all together to discuss all these important themes.
That'd be super exciting.
Yes, and then with Anna Maffini, we will think about this and organize maybe as soon as possible. And then thank you for all that colleagues that are here with us in this morning. And again, to Professor Marcus to be with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It really was a pleasure. And I'm sorry for my long answers. So there were very few questions. But on the other hand, they were very good questions. So that was very exciting. Thank you. And that would be wonderful to meet some way or another in real life.
Okay.
We can go to Sweden. We can travel.
That's also an option. Let's think about it. Yeah.
School trip, Sweden.
Yes.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Would be very good. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.